That last bit's a bit awkward for me, isn't it?
Deuteronomy 24. The man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. And if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, then her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God. Well, as you know, I'm into number 3 of a 5-week series on relationships. So we've looked at marriage, the genius of marriage. We looked at communication in marriage, love languages and the like. This week I want to look at the whole issue of divorce. And then I'm going to be away for a couple of weeks, so we pick it up again, as I note in my newsletter, I think towards the end of July and beginning of August, to look at sex and marriage and also same-sex attraction. But this morning I want to look at the topic of divorce. You know, there are lots of tough passages in the Bible, lots of tough passages that we read and we kind of like wince at or grimace over and think, I wish I hadn't read that. Some of them we think, some of them we're not too worried about because they don't affect us personally. But when they do, we have to work at it. We have to dig into it. We have to figure out what it actually is saying. And the scriptures and the things that Jesus is saying on divorce strike right at the heart of many people's lives. And the application of Jesus' teaching to today has, I believe, resulted in a lot of unnecessary pain in the past for people. I think the church has handled the question of divorce badly in the past. I think we are doing a little bit better today, but in the past I think we caused a lot of unnecessary pain. A story. My name is Catherine, and I left my marriage of 19 years and sought help at Women's Refuge. I had come to the point where I couldn't go on living with a partner who drank excessively and was very possessive, jealous, powerful and often demanding, who had control not only of myself but also over our children, one being a foster child. I had left twice because of the beatings I had been receiving and the constant put-downs. My eldest son, now 20 years old, had become included in the hidings and put-downs from an early age. My youngest son and the foster son too were also victims of the same treatment. Fortunately, the girls were not touched. We all lived in fear and often anticipated his moods. We lived like robots, did and said things to keep him happy. I enjoyed running. It was my only escape in some ways. For 9 years I ran because it helped me cope with the pressures of a very demanding and dominating partner. I'd also become very interested in many crafts. These too helped me to relax and enjoy what little I could of the things I loved doing. And participation as a family in a sports club often gave me the space and enjoyment I craved. But slowly, each little pleasure or space was taken away from me. I have for some years been denied many things as a person, a woman and a mother. I can still remember the last beating he gave me before I finally left with my 2 girls. Although my partner never laid a hand on the girls, they too suffered emotionally and would often block their ears to drown out the yelling and screaming in the house. I knew that when we left that day that I would never ever return. I now wait anxiously for the day when I can say that legally I am no longer his property. Catherine is in the process of getting a divorce from this man. And the question is that I would ask you today is, what does the teaching of Jesus in the gospel mean for her in terms of how the church would have applied it to her? What would the church, in reading the Gospels, want to say to Catherine? A few decades ago it would have meant firstly that we would have said to her, you shouldn't be getting a divorce at all. Stick it out. That's what we would have said to her at first. Secondly, once the divorce came through, she would have been stigmatised. She would not have been allowed to participate in groups like Mothers Union, for example. And I've heard many stories from women who have been involved in Mothers Union, which was a kind of like an early version of AAW, the Association of Anglican Women, who once they became divorced could no longer be a part of that group. And part of me understands why, because there's a sense in which if you don't have this, if there's no consequence to the decisions we make, it's almost like we're saying it doesn't matter or it becomes too easy. But on the other hand, especially where for a woman for whom her husband was unfaithful or he was the guilty party, so to speak, and she maybe wanted to preserve the marriage but got the divorce happen anyway, she is the victim, and yet she becomes a victim twice because she's stigmatised and so on. And lastly, it would have meant that the church would not have allowed her to remarry. And that was the rules in the past based on the teachings, or how people saw the teaching in the Gospels. A lot has changed since that time. Some of it for the better, not all of it. We now have roughly 9,000 divorces a year in New Zealand, 22,000 marriages, and 1/3 of those for people who have been previously married. Catherine today would not be stopped from divorcing her husband. There is really no stigmatism of divorcees anymore in New Zealand. And she would be allowed to remarry if they came to me and she wanted to remarry after an appropriate discussion about understanding why the previous marriage did not work, and trying to figure out, who was the guilty party and all the rest of it, and work had been done and an understanding of why it hadn't gone well. Then probably more than likely I would be able to and would take the marriage for her again. Domestic violence is still with us. 1 in 10 New Zealanders are affected by it. 10 children a year dying from it, as we've seen so often in the papers. And 1 woman is killed by her partner or ex every 5 weeks. So what does the teaching of Jesus around divorce mean for us today? Let's take a closer look. Matthew 19 verse 3. Some Pharisees came to test him, and they said to Jesus, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. So therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" And Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. And I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery." Tough teaching, eh? And Jesus here is referring back to Deuteronomy 24, what we read out, where it was required that the husband, if he found some indecency other than adultery, which required the death penalty, that he would give his wife a certificate of divorce, a statement formally ending the marriage, and then she would be free to leave the home. In the Jewish Mishnah Gittin, chapter 9 verse 3, it says this, that the certificate must say these words, "Behold, you are free to any man," free to be remarried. Or, according to Rabbi Judas, "Let this be to you from me a writ of divorce, a letter of release, and a decree of dismissal to permit you to be married to any man you desire." So on the giving of a decree or a writ of divorce worded in that kind of fashion, the woman was therefore formally declared to be divorced from her husband, and she was free to leave the home and to marry another. And likewise, I guess the husband was free to remarry as well, because it was only men who actually could divorce. Women could not. Only men could divorce. And this teaching, this writ of divorce and grounds for divorce, had become enshrined in rabbinic law. The rabbinic school of Shammai, for example, only allowed for, in terms of trying to figure out exactly what was meant by the wording of Deuteronomy, only allowed for authenticated and witnessed sexual misdemeanors short of adultery as grounds for divorce. But the school of Hillel, which tended to be the norm in Jesus' day, allowed for any complaint, even to something as trivial as burning the dinner, as grounds for divorce. Shammai said this, "A man should not divorce his wife except where he has found in her a case for scandal, as it is said, because he has found in her a scandalous thing." And we understand that Shammai interpreted that as a witnessed, authenticated sexual misdemeanor. But the school of Hillel said he may divorce his wife even if she has burned his supper, as it is said, because he has found in her a scandalous thing. So they were interpreting the word "a scandalous thing" as, well, Shammai was interpreting it as being something of a sexual nature that was improper, whereas for Hillel he was interpreting a scandalous thing as simple as something as burning the dinner. Rabbi Akiba went further. He said he may divorce his wife even if he has found another more becoming than she, as it is said, and if she does not find favour in your eyes. Deuteronomy 24. So for Rabbi Akiba, he was interpreting the word favour in a very subjective way. In other words, if he saw another hot chick walking down the road and thought she was a bit of alright, then it was permissible for him to actually divorce his wife and to go and remarry that other woman. Whereas of course the word favour there is not to do with that very subjective looking around the room and spotting the more prettier girl. It's more to do, I think, with the very objective recognition of character within the person. There is something about the woman's character that, in terms of the way they started to live or the things that they started to do, that have actually meant that they have lost your respect. And probably it was to be of a sexual nature. In other words, they had begun to interpret the scriptures very, very loosely, and probably for their own benefit, in a very permissive kind of way. Jesus, however, in contrast to that, to the tradition of Hillel and others, highlights the Genesis ideal, where a man and a woman shall leave their respective families and come together and to be joined into a single union and to remain that way until death do them part. And he regards therefore as divorce as allowed for under Hillel as illegal, and thereby renders both parties as adulterers if they remarry. So if a man decides that he's found someone whom he likes more than his current wife and decides that he can divorce her and remarry that other woman, Jesus would actually say that divorce is invalid. It's not a good enough reason. It's not a good enough reason. And if you go and remarry when in a sense your marriage is not really properly ended, then I would declare you to be an adulterer, which was strong words, because adultery was punishable by stoning. So he's sending a really clear message to the Pharisees that their attitude and their acceptance of the teaching of Hillel was just such a weakening of the Genesis story and the Genesis kind of like understanding of what marriage is for men and women, that it just wasn't acceptable, not acceptable at all. The marriage ideal is that a man and a woman from stable homes come together in marriage with appropriate preparation, with the support of their families, the society, the wider society and the local community. They join together in marriage with a true understanding of what that is, and then they live together until death part them. It's a union in which a family is created, where children, if they come, will be raised and nurtured in a very stable and loving environment, an environment which will actually help them to reach their full potential. To quote from the Anglican prayer book, marriage, these are the words I use when I'm marrying people. Marriage is the promise of hope between a man and a woman who love one another, who trust that love, and who wish to share their future together. It enables two separate people to share their desires and longings, dreams and memories, and to help each other through the uncertainties of life. It provides the encouragement to risk more and thus to gain more. In marriage, husband and wife belong together, providing mutual support in an environment, a stable relationship in which their children may grow to full maturity. And as a society, we recognise and affirm this new relationship as the couple begin their new life together. That's the ideal. That's the ideal. But sadly, as we all know, we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a broken world, a fallen world, where there are many who come from dysfunctional backgrounds. They come with poor relational skills. They have little support from their families, and often they come together in a marriage that almost for some seems destined for failure from the beginning. For others, with a better start, pressures of money, work, personal aspirations and so on mean that their relationship begins to struggle, and sometimes they drift apart and come to the point where they also are wanting to seek divorce. So what would Jesus say to people like that? What would people say in those situations? What does the scripture actually teach us about divorce? Initially, as you read what Jesus was saying, it comes across as pretty tough. But we need to look at it a little closer, and we need to look at the bigger picture throughout scripture as well. Firstly, Jesus is promoting the ideal, obviously. He's strongly putting forward the picture of Genesis 1, where one man and one woman come together for life. But he was doing so because he was responding to a situation where the ideal had become so watered down and so weakened that you could literally divorce your wife for burning the dinner. That's what he was responding to. And in response to that very weak situation, he's putting up very strongly the ideal, just to, in a sense, to highlight the contrast it, to highlight the difference between the two.